Thank you. I want to start out with a little story that isn't directly related to the Middle East, and then I want to talk a little bit about U.S. military history in the Middle East recently, and then about the use of the military to resolve some of these problems. I was a second lieutenant in Vietnam, and I was assigned as an advisor to the Vietnamese Marines. I went to language school, I wore their uniform, I hardly ever saw another American, I lived in their villages. When I came home from that war, I saw an entirely different war than my counterparts who were in US units fighting in other parts of Vietnam. I went back again in a US unit, but I saw the war entirely differently. Fast forward through many different operations to when I went to Somalia. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about how we got into Somalia because it's a rich lesson that may go, I think, for future presidents to understand how to use or not use the military. President Bush, 41, the elder, committed us to the mission in Somalia to provide security for the UN operation that was going on. It's important to note that he had already lost the election when he sent 28,000 troops there. So we went in to Somalia with a president that was leaving office in a few weeks after we got in. When we got there, within 19 days, we had literally, with our allies that were with us, secured all of the part of Somalia we were responsible for, and humanitarian aid and supplies were beginning to flow. People were not starving to death anymore. We had constant problem with the warlords and the gangs and the other things that caused trouble, but we were able to handle it. President made a visit out to see us just before the inauguration. And when he came out there, and he was glad to see the troops are glad to see him. As we were briefing him, I asked him a question. I said, Mr. President, what's the arrangement next? What do we do now? We own the place. To quote Colin Powell, you break it, you own it, the Pottery Barn rule. We now own Somalia. There was no government, there was no police force, we were it. And I remember him looking at Brent Scowcroft, his national security advisor that was there, Marlon Fitzwater, his public affairs chief, and he said, Brent, Marlon, have we made an arrangement? Is there something that we've done with the UN to take over this mission? And they kind of looked in the air and said, no, Mr. President. And we all kind of looked down. We were stuck. We owned it. You know, it was the Pottery Barn example. And so every time we face a crisis like this, and I certainly can feel the passion, believe me, I've been on plenty of battlefields and I've seen the images that were just described in my life. When you send in the Marines to take care of the problem, you need to answer a critical question. And then what? Now, we could go into Syria and we can go into northern Iraq, and when I say we, the United States, NATO, whatever the first-class forces are, and we could eliminate ISIS within weeks, less than weeks. And I would tell you, I would have done this just because of the atrocities I've witnessed. But then the question becomes, and then what? Do we own it? You know, it's the Hotel California. If you're an Eagles fan, you can check in, but it's damn hard to check out. So you have to remember that when you decide on military solutions. I completely agree that we screwed this up when we went into Iraq. That was the biggest mistake we could have made in this region. And it went against, in more ways than I think the Bush administration understood, against the policy of our military involvement ever since Jimmy Carter created the Rapid Deployment Joint Task Force, which became CENTCOM in the Reagan administration. You know, it seems counterintuitive, but as a CENTCOM commander in that era before the incursion in Iraq, I retired in 2000, just before 9/11. Our job was to limit our military in this region. CENTCOM had no assigned military forces. The Rapid Deployment Joint Task Force was created as a bulwark, as a deterrence, as a signal against Soviet incursion into Iran and the Persian Gulf because they were worried about the energy resources and the control of the trade routes through that area. And if you look at through the doctrine of the two pillars, Iran before the Shah and Saudi Arabia, eventually the dual containment, the basic underlining tenet of our strategy out there was deterrence and containment, was to look strong, make sure we had allies in the region, but at all costs, unless absolutely necessary, not to use force. Now, when we were put in a position where we had to do that, when Saddam invaded Kuwait, the Bush administration went to the United Nations to get the authority to use force. The authority was limited to Kuwait, expelling the forces of Iraq out of Kuwait, not going to Baghdad and making it the 51st state, because they were well aware of what the cost was and the long-term problems you would inherit and the instability you would generate in the region. We stayed within the UN restrictions. We immediately went into a mode of containment and deterrence. If you were to go to CENTCOM before 9/11, you would have seen less troops in that theater of operations than report to work at the Pentagon every day. You wouldn't believe that because it seemed like CENTCOM was a major regional command and obviously was faced with a number of problematic situations that could erupt. But underlying everything we did was not to do something to destabilize the region. When the decision was made to go into Iraq after 9/11, I was in the region. I was sitting with a couple of friends of mine, and we were listening to the My Fellow American speech given by President Bush. And he was talking about what this war was going to be all about. It was going to be about the forces of freedom and democracy against the forces of evil and dictatorship. And one of my Arab friends turned to me and said, "This is about Persians versus Arabs. You're about to unleash a devil we have tried to keep, under the sand for a long time." Other friend of mine sitting on the other side said, "This is about Shia versus Arabs. Sunnis. You're going to unleash a religious war if you go in." And I thought, my president's not wrong, but does he understand these other two implications? What he is about to unleash here? To make it worse, we had plans to go into Iraq. We had plans to go into any possible threat in the region. And when I left CENTCOM, the plan I left required 380,000 troops if you were going into Iraq. It was not to defeat the Republican Guard or to take down Saddam's regime. You needed 380,000 troops to secure the border and secure the population and make sure they didn't kill each other, that it didn't come apart like a cheap suitcase. That was the purpose of those troops. If you can remember back to General Shinseki testifying before Congress and saying you will need at least 300,000 troops and being dismissed. If you remember the words of Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, this will be a cakewalk. There'll be flowers in the streets. This is not an occupation. This is a liberation. And again, I go back to the point of not understanding the region, the people, the issues you're dealing with. The military participation out there had long been one of reluctance. CENTCOM was created during the Cold War. When the Cold War ended, there was talk of dismantling CENTCOM. It would no longer exist, that the European Command would pick up CENTCOM's mission. CENTCOM, if you looked at its original area of responsibility, did not include the Levant, Syria, Lebanon, elsewhere, never included Israel. It wasn't focused internally, it was focused externally to potential threats. Of course, once the Iranians, the Shah took over, and afterwards, once Saddam went his way, with the Russians being more involved in countries like Syria and Iran, CENTCOM built itself up into a different mission, but still with the underlying deterrence and containment as the first options. There were times in the Persian Gulf, when I was the commander of CENTCOM, when we had Iranian ships that would deliberately charge at our ships, even bump them. And the constraint that our captains of our ships did to not fire on them was amazing. To me, that what kept me up at night. We did everything we could to avoid a confrontation and destabilization. If you looked at where our troops were located out there, they were off in the desert, in bases that they were basically unseen. We had a presence that outwardly belied the true numbers on the ground, the positions we were in. But that changed with the incursion into Iraq, done in the wrong way, with too few troops, without an understanding of the aftermath, and basically was the genesis of the problems we have now. We made another mistake in Afghanistan. Afghanistan should have been about getting al-Qaeda, period. If we'd have gone in following the Colin Powell doctrine, the Caspar Weinberger doctrine, the way we handled Desert Storm, overwhelming force, get al-Qaeda, and we would have had them at Tora Bora, and then leave. But we decided to stay, this is mistake number 3, and rebuild nations. We don't know how to rebuild nations. And in the end, it gets the military who is stuck with the rebuilding effort. I did an assessment in Iraq and Afghanistan after I retired. I did one in Iraq for General Odierno, one in Afghanistan for General Mattis and General Allen. The one thing that stood out to me was all the things that the military was doing that were not military tasks. I sat there next to General Odierno in Iraq at his morning briefings, and within about 4 days of me being there, I had 56 things written down that no way, shape, or form were military missions. They were running the agricultural programs, the date palm harvest, providing pesticides, the mediation groups working between the different tribal and ethnic and religious leaders to mend fences. They were running recreational swimming pools, museums. This is the military. In Iraq, they were running the anti-corruption task force. 80% of the provincial reconstruction teams designed to help at low-level province and district governance issues, 80% were military wearing a uniform. And you were wondering how we got into this mess, how we ended up with our military trying to rebuild governments, economies, social systems, which is not our function. If you look what happened at the end, once Saddam fell, who governed Iraq? Provisional coalition team that came in under Bremer. It was a pickup team. Ad hoc. No one had ever planned for it. It was scraped together from God knows where in the State Department, from embassies that had no people that were experienced in the Middle East, thrown in there, and decisions made that we knew well before were a mistake, disbanding the military, closing the state-owned factories and putting people out of work. We created this mess. I would tell you right now what I would do. I think it's time for NATO to stand up to this mission. We have suffered more casualties in NATO countries with innocent civilians, be it in Paris, be it somewhere in Belgium, be it San Bernardino, than we would ever have suffered by just putting in a NATO military force and eliminating ISIS as a first step. But I want to go back to the point made before. Eliminating ISIS is a necessary first step. But then the question becomes, and then what? Eventually, after 2+ years of ISIS controlling Raqqa, Mosul, and committing the atrocities against Yazidis, Chaldeans, and everybody else in the region that they didn't particularly like, you know, we have a situation where nobody's talking about what this will look like after ISIS goes. Now, this administration that we have now opted for a slow attrition, trying to bleed ISIS through special operations, throwing local forces against them just to get slaughtered, and using airstrikes, which in many cases are indiscriminate. In the end, ISIS will go, one way or another. Who is sitting down talking about how we put Humpty Dumpty back together again? Can you put it back together again? Can Syria be reconstructed as Syria as a nation? Can Iraq, in northern Iraq? One of the operations I went on was the rescue of the Kurds from Saddam's slaughter. And when we went in there, we had a commitment to protect the Kurds. Again, once we touched it, we owned it. And so for 12 years, we had to commit our military to the protection of the Kurds. So when this ends, where does the protection come from? Who will get the mission? Will it be the United Nations? Will it be a NATO? Will it be a US-led coalition of the willing? How much of our treasure and commitment is it going to take? What will be the outcome? How much public support will it get back here? You know, when you tell a mother that her son or daughter has to go fight for some place that she can't find on a map, that's pretty difficult. When you talk about an economy that's stretched and said it's going to cost you a lot of money to sustain this over the long term, and that's going to be taxpayer dollars, that's a tough sell. However morally right it is, there's some realities that have to be taken into account. When you tell your military to take on this mission, where else in the world are you able to and willing to take risks? Is it going to be over Estonia because Putin gets adventuresome? Is it going to be someplace in the Pacific because the Chinese decide to stretch out their zone of influence? These are the realities of military intervention. You know, we try to create allies. I appreciate the question about security assistance out there. It's not only the selling of equipment or the offering of equipment, it's training, it's trying to make responsible militaries, and that's a mixed bag as to whether you're successful in that. One of the two proudest moments I had as a CENTCOM commander is when two different commanders of militaries of two different countries said to me they were under pressure to take over the government, and they refused to do it. And when I asked them why, they laughed and said, because you trained me too well. Because the schools I went to in the United States taught me that's not what I do as the head of the military. Now, that's not always the case, I'll admit that. But once in a while, you do get a success. Once in a while, you find a worthy ally that will join you in the battlefield and be on your right flank when you need them the most. And sometimes you don't. And you're competing against others that will walk in that door and provide that same assistance in a heartbeat. The Russias and Chinas of the world will do it in order to gain influence, in order to upset our influence and our leadership. I would comment on one thing that was said before, and that's the United States is the leader of the world. The first thing any president's going to learn is the limitations on his power, because it's easy to think you're omnipotent. You're going to find out how limited your power truly is. You're going to find out that you have to make judgments and take risks that you weren't expecting. You can't buy off the risks. Your treasure isn't that great. You can't use the military to solve every problem in the world. You can't expect that your influence is going to be automatic. You're not the Pope. You just happen to be the president of a country that does get respect, that is admired, that will have everybody pulling on your coattails, wanting you to come do something for them, and they will explain the moral principle that you should follow that means that that's mandatory. But you're going to learn that options will be put in front of you that range from a strong letter of protest to a 10-kiloton nuclear airburst. And somewhere in there, you're supposed to find the right answer. And none of them are clean, or they wouldn't even be up to your level. As Henry Kissinger said, you're often making choices to pick out the lesser evil in what you have to do. It's not necessarily that the president wants to do that. You know, we go back in history and we criticize presidents, from John Adams and his Alien and Sedition Acts, from Lincoln, from his waiver of habeas corpus, and Wilson doing the same thing. We criticize FDR for the internment of the Japanese and others. And we certainly criticize President Bush for, quote, enhanced interrogation techniques, which are stupid, as General Mattis pointed out. They made mistakes, and it's easy to look back and see them, but it clearly points out that they don't have perfect answers being presented to them. And they have a lot of people trying to influence them and groups trying to influence them. There is no perfect ally out there. There is no one that's going to share all the burden. You know, when we went into Iraq and Desert Storm, we did it with a UN resolution. We did it with a coalition that General Schwarzkopf had that had dozens of countries contributing. At the end, when you went to the deterrence and containment, the no-fly zones, the no-drive zones, the maritime intercept operations, you had 2 countries left, the United States and the United Kingdom. So when we think about coalitions of the willing, we think about NATO and the United Nations. As my friend General Shinseki used to say, you have swimmers and non-swimmers. And a lot of them get out of the pool in the shallow end, and they're not around when it gets deep. So the realities of saving the world have to be measured by the limitations of power we have, and the limitations our own military has. Our military is not composed of a bunch of crazy generals that want to go to war. Matter of fact, just about everyone I ever met, that's the last thing they want to do, because the cost is going to be in those troops that they love. The cost is going to be at a military capability you may need for other things in terms of protection of your nation. You know, we are instruments of power, as Clausewitz said. War is politics by other means. And those politics are made by politicians that those of us in this room that are citizens of this country elect and put in place to make those decisions. And we have to remember that. This isn't done by somebody who we have no responsibility for. It's our voice. And it's going to be our voice that sustains anything that president commits us to. So my words of caution about when we look at the military: you send in the military will go. The military just needs to know, what do you want me to do? What is the outcome you want me to achieve? And how do you want me to do it? And if a president can't answer that question, then he or she should not launch that military machine. Thank you.